Welcome to Behavior and Risk, where we explore the intersection of decisions, the brain, uncertainty, and the business world. I'm John Burkhart.
And I'm Rich Loria.
We're glad you took a chance on us today. Why do financial institutions collapse? What are the causes, what are the risk factors, and what can be done to prevent collapses in the future? That's the central question we've been asking the last few episodes. There are certain commonalities that recur, historically speaking: highly leveraged positions, overconfidence resulting from prolonged success, undue faith in the status quo, failures to account for changes in market conditions. And we've examined all of these in previous episodes, discussing deal lust, Silicon Valley Bank, what have you, and myriad other examples. But these aren't the only ways that institutions can collapse. Sometimes you get a true outlier, a case that unfolds in unexpected ways at every turn. And as a scientist, I love outliers. Unusual cases tend to manifest behavioral extremes, and these tell us a lot about how and why people make choices, and how we can predict and thus subsequently attempt to de-risk future decisions. So in this episode, we're going to talk about one of the most unusual financial collapses in recent history: FTX trading. FTX has been in the news a great deal of late, as what would appear to be the final round of trials and congressional testimonies have wrapped up in the last few months. At present, all of its principals have been convicted of one thing or another. Most are serving prison terms, and one of its co-founders, Sam Bankman-Fried, who became the face of FTX during its collapse, has just started serving a 25-year sentence. The FTX collapse is notable in how quickly it rose and fell. An associated company, Alameda Research, that will be important in the future, was founded in September of 2017, and FTX was spun up in May of 2019. FTX was an abbreviation of Futures Exchange, and their primary business was as a cryptocurrency exchange. From its 2019 inception, FTX would hit a peak valuation of over $32 billion in 2022. So just about 3 years from inception to 32 plus billion dollars. It all came to a crashing halt in November of that year, and before the end of November 2022, FTX would file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. So then we have to ask ourselves, what happened? Why did FTX collapse? What were the decisions that led to it? What were the signs beforehand? And what could have been done to prevent it? This is a really interesting one, so strap in. To understand just how unusual this case is, I feel like we really need to start by looking at the dynamics of the collapse itself. As mentioned, FTX was a cryptocurrency exchange. They bought and they sold crypto and crypto-derived products, as well as enabling their customers to do so. They also offer their own token, FTT, and all in all, FTX's service offering was pretty garden variety. Rich, you and I have talked about this in some of our conversations leading up to this, and I think we both agree that this was, as crypto offerings go, a pretty structurally sound offering. There were no real extreme positions that were taken. They were largely well capitalized. You come from a more purely financial or traditionally financial background than I do. Is there anything in FTX's structure that strikes you as unusual or particularly risk prone, other than it being crypto and all that that entails?
Thank you, John. My assessment of FTX, at least from the limited information that's available in the public domain, is that they were the adult version of a crypto exchange. And let's keep in mind what an exchange is. An exchange is a place for investors to come and to make exchanges of certain assets for other types of assets or cash. So FTX was, in and of itself, was never about taking lots of risk. It was about enabling others to take risk. And in fact, they had more guardrails up for investors than some of their competing firms, most notably Binance. And that lent a certain air of credibility to what they were doing.
Yeah, it all seems as though this is not the sort of institution of service offering, of financial asset portfolio that you would really expect to see go belly up, particularly in so fast and spectacular a fashion. And it really was. It was, as these things go, it was overnight. It basically all took place throughout the first 10 days of November of 2022. And I find that really interesting. Now, ultimately, of course, what has come out since is that there was a huge amount of managerial malfeasance behind the scenes. Operationally, they had enormous problems in terms of how they were conducting certain offerings, certain practices, and that's putting a very mild spin on it, I think is pretty safe to say. But again, we come back to the fundamentals were all pretty sound. And so in a lot of ways, this seems like just an old-fashioned bank run. There was bad news, there was questions that were raised around the relative solvency of FTX, and all the investors just started to try to pull their money out. And there's only so much liquidity you can part with before a financial institution cannot tolerate withdrawals anymore. And that's really what happened here. So we want to talk about the malfeasance because that really primed everything that happened and offers a lot of window into some interesting choices that were made and why they perhaps were made and what lessons we can take from that. But you've brought up some interesting thoughts around why this run was kindled and what role certain outside forces might have played in that.
Yeah, thank you, John. There was definitely external forces. This is where something that we teach in the ERM program called root cause analysis becomes very challenging to do. Because in and of itself, the malfeasance that had been clearly going on for years, particularly taking and lending customer funds without consent from customers, was not something that was easily seen during a growth period or even during quote unquote normal times within the crypto industry. It was really two specific events that triggered the downfall and uncovered the problems. The first being the collapse of the Terra Luna system, which you and I have talked about previously. But Terra Luna was a competing ecosystem in the blockchain crypto area. And Terra Luna, in and of itself, was a stablecoin mechanism that suffered a similar run on its own currency. And that run on those stable coins triggered problems within it triggered a contagion within other stable coins, including the FTT token, which was at the core of the whole FTX crypto exchange.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I want to come back to that a little bit down the road after we talk about some of the major individual actors in here, that the crypto domain itself generally is prone to runs. And there are a lot of reasons for this, but I think one of the biggest is that as an emerging market, as an emerging asset class, people just don't have a lot of confidence in it. And I don't mean that in the sense that they're intrinsically suspicious of crypto, just the rules are not very well established. When you see a security perhaps take a nosedive, you know what that means. You have a sense of how it may respond or rebound in the future. Crypto is still new for most people. And I think that there's a lot of, you could say, the wisdom of herds, but really it's just more a herd mentality when these initial runs start to occur, even in unrelated assets.
Those are good points, John. I think one of the things that a new asset class such as crypto is always going to face challenges with is the lack of availability bias. Or maybe put another way, it is our tendency as humans to search for historical reference to anchor one's thoughts or one's assessments to. And we simply don't have that with crypto. So therefore, when things start to go south on a particular crypto asset, there tends to be a fight or flight. And in this case, largely a flight mentality, which tends to occur. And therefore, the ultimate asset value gets driven down to somewhere close to zero.
Sure. So you mentioned two external factors, Terra Luna, and then you didn't get around to the second one. What's the second?
The second is Binance and Binance's statements, Binance's actions during that critical period between when the Terra Luna system went into bankruptcy and when FTX ultimately went into bankruptcy. There was a period in between those two events, which both occurred during 2022, where Binance, as the largest exchange, became involved. First, they became involved in buying a lot of FTT tokens. So they became a significant holder in those tokens and therefore had undue ability to affect the value. And they, after buying those tokens initially, decided to sell out. And they made that sale based on an initial report that had been leaked to Coinbase that messaged about the relationship between FTX and Alameda Research, a sister company, that their ties were much closer and much murkier, and that much of Alameda Research's value was based on the FTT token, which again had no collateral behind it. So therefore was subject to whatever the mark was that was officially given to it, which, given that most of the FTT tokens were being held by FTX/Alameda, left it largely in their hands. So when Binance came in and made a large sale, that drove down the value, which put pressure on the underlying balance sheet and further exposed the flaws in the whole financial structure of FTX.
And I think it's very interesting that Sam Bankman-Fried, one of the founders of FTX, and the founder of Binance, whose name is escaping me, Changpeng something, I believe. Changpeng Zhao, that is his name, had a long-standing and very public feud with each other. Spilled over onto Twitter. They were not particularly fans of each other. Now, I want to make it very clear that what I'm about to say is purely the realm of speculation. I have no evidence. There is, as far as I'm aware, no documentation indicating that this is factually correct. This is purely my own speculation. But if you look at how this unfolded and you consider that standing animosity between Zhao and Bankman-Fried, it looks very much like almost a hit. Like Binance was aware of some of the problems underlying FTX or some of the murkier dealings underlying FTX and decided that they would do what they could to drive down the value. Is that obviously we can't say whether or not that happened. We don't have any firsthand knowledge of this or even secondhand knowledge of this, but to my eyes, that's what it looks could have occurred here. Is that within reason, would you say?
I think that's fair to say, John. That could have been in the thinking of Changpeng Zhao, because the relationship between FTX and Binance goes back to FTX's creation. In fact, Binance was an early investor in FTX when FTX was just a fledgling exchange. However, given the very aggressive marketing plan and the seductive abilities of SBF and his team, they quickly became not only another market competitor, but they became a threat to the dominant position of Binance. That's very clear in some of the statements that they were taking FTX seriously. And it's quite conceivable that some of the actions during the market volatility generated by the Terra Luna collapse, when a lot of crypto stable coins were in flux and had depreciated in value, that this was seen as an opportunity to perhaps take out another exchange.
And particularly given how the run unfolded, I think it would potentially support that conclusion. Again, I emphasize we can't say this is what happened. It seems the dots seem to connect. But one of the things I find particularly interesting is that despite filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, as of today, where we sit in December of 2024, it looks as though all of the FTX investors will get all of their deposits back and possibly more. So there was a precipitous decline in value, but it wasn't a lingering one. And I believe that Binance has taken a stake in the remains of FTX.
That's correct. And remember that one of the other major triggers, so I talked about two, there are arguably more than that, but I would connect this all together to the role of Binance, is that Binance offered to buy FTX. There was a 24-hour, maybe even less than 24-hour period where it looked like Binance was going to take over FTX. They were going to be the white knight, which, as we've talked about with SVB and other bank runs, is a common resolution when there is a financial institution that's struggling, that a stronger, more capitalized competitor will come in and be a white knight. That's how Binance had positioned themselves, but they quickly did an about face. It was 24 hours, and they did an about face and said, no, we're not touching this. And that in and of itself was the beginning of the end.
So let's talk about what might have happened and why they might have done that about face, because it was shockingly fast. The assumption is when you have one of these white knights coming in, they will do their due diligence, they will examine the books, they'll examine operations and decide whether or not this is a good fit, how it will integrate with their own operations, what sort of financial load will it put on them. And this sort of assessment takes some time. We've seen this in recent months rather, with SVB and how some of that acquisition was structured. And it took some time, and the FDIC actually it had to mediate much of that. Whereas here, Binance looked at it for less than 2 days and then immediately backed off and said, nope. Didn't even say, no, we need a smaller price or we need restructuring. They just said, we don't want this. That immediately suggests that there were some monstrous problems in play. Knowing what we know now, we have a pretty good idea of what a lot of those flaws were. I mentioned earlier on that Alameda was going to be important later. Alameda was as you mentioned, a sister company of FTX, spun up actually 2 years prior by all the same principles, all the same people involved, and it had a similar financial services bent, although less focused on crypto. And on paper, it appeared as though it was just a separate financial services house owned by the same people doing marginally related things, but operating in different spaces. What's become clear is that Alameda Research and FTX were never really separated in any capacity. Alameda was the largest depositor of stablecoins into FTX. Alameda had an unlimited line of credit with FTX and was exempted from posting any collateral when they drew on that line of credit. And it's known that in 2022 alone, FTX lent $10 billion of FTX customer assets to Alameda. This is something that within a traditional securities brokerage or securities firm would be utterly forbidden by every conceivable SEC regulation. But given the current state of regulation, which I know you want to talk about in a bit here, there's no specific prohibition about that. It's definitely frowned upon, and it may or may not be legal or acceptable, but there's not a clear rule against it. Per courtroom testimony, it's been suggested that Alameda misappropriated as much as $65 billion lifetime from its FTX customers. And to the point that apparently from the earliest days of FTX's operation, there was a patch built into FTX's back end, allowing the direct movement of funds between these two organizations. It was a separation in name only. These were never separate companies. And this sort of gets at something that I found really interesting when I started my dive on this. When I started off looking into this, the main question I had set out for myself was, why did they do this? Why did management at FTX and Alameda go so deep down this hole? What were they doing? How could they make these choices? And on my earliest review, I found myself thinking, okay, these were just some very smart people who were accustomed to always being the smartest people in the room, who thought they knew more about the crypto space than they actually did, and probably made a bad choice or encountered a piece of friction at some point and had to make a questionable decision to try to float themselves along the way. You raised a parallel with what was the equity corporation?
Equity funding, which is actually an insurance company from the 1970s.
Right. You raised a parallel there where basically you cross a small line to try to float your position for a week or 2 weeks. And then that makes it that much easier then to cross a bigger line when you encounter another problem. And this just compounds and feeds forward. In the behavioral space, we call this moral licensing. The more violations you have of an ethical position, of a point of honesty, the easier it becomes to make greater violations downstream. And so it looked superficially like that's what happened here. You had these people who just thought they knew more than they did, found themselves in a position where they had to make some questionable choices, and they just kept making more and more questionable choices. But the deeper I dove, the less I believe that. I don't have that position anymore. And I think that based on what is publicly available and based on what we can infer from the aggregated choices and behaviors of all of the principals involved in both FTX and Alameda, this was something that was fully known and fully intended from the get-go. From the day that FTX was launched, this was all part of the plan. And I use plan there very specifically. This was all intended. None of this was accidental. None of this was something that they found themselves having to do because it would solve a short-term problem. Again, I want to emphasize this is all of my own reasoning and speculation. Nobody is on record as saying this is what happened. This is my own inference, but I feel like it's pretty well justified. Looking over the backgrounds of all of the principals involved here, there was something that kept popping up in all of their histories and all of their personal educational backgrounds. All the people here had very similar backgrounds. They were all hotshots all the way back to middle school and high school, academic overachievers, used to being, as I said, the smartest people in the room. They all went to Ivies and Ivy adjacent institutions. And every single one of them has some connection with a branch of moral philosophy called effective altruism. Now, I'd never heard of this before, and if it had just been a throwaway sentence in one of their biographies, I never would have thought twice about it. But it kept recurring, and I found myself having to ask, what is this? And in digging it up, effective altruism is a branch of moral philosophy that says that basically you should take a considered, rational, and as much as possible quantitative approach to figure out how can you do the most amount of good for the most amount of people. I'm going to make a very small subset of philosophers very angry when I offer this conclusion that it's basically, as I read it, lipstick on utilitarianism. It's a very modern version of utilitarianism that says whatever actions create the most good is the correct action. One of the interesting things about this philosophy is that it specifically advocates choosing your career based on how you can do the most good. And if we look at some of the parallel actions of Bankman-Fried, who's become really the face of this, but I think all of the principals involved were equally culpable. Bankman-Fried was very politically active, an avid political donor, donated substantially to pandemic or anti-pandemic causes. It very much looks like these people thought that if we make all the money in the world, imagine all the good that we can do. The money that was shuttled into Alameda was not embezzled. It was used to try to double down and make high risk investments and high leverage option investments and purchases. It was all done to try to make more money. And it really looks like these individuals just said, we know best what to do with all this money. Imagine what we could do with all the money in the world. And here's a domain where we can do it. It's interesting because, again, my own speculation, I really think if you were to get Bankman-Fried alone and in a truly unfiltered conversation, I bet he would reveal that he was fully aware that what he was doing was not considered above board, but that he truly believes that he didn't do anything wrong. That would be my guess. And that's a very, very interesting shape of heuristic biased thinking. It's not dishonesty in the traditional sense because they truly believe that they were doing the good thing.
So, John, that's a very interesting perspective about effective altruism. I have to be honest with you, I had never considered that angle. However, taking a look now at the history of events, I think there's even additional smoking guns that support what you were saying.
Okay.
If we think about the timeline of Alameda and FTX and the actions that FTX were taking to support Alameda, Alameda was initially set up and primarily its operations were to be a trading firm, to make money through trading, through speculation, through using a lot of leverage, doing as much as they can to make as much money as quickly as they could. To your point, probably to support a lot of the causes that they really, really believed in. However, they didn't have enough capital initially on their own, or likely burned through quite a bit of capital because, again, you're not going to get all these bets right. You're going to have times when you get a number wrong in a row. And if you get enough wrong in a row, you're going to need to find more access to capital. And I believe, again, this is my speculation, that FTX was created as a mechanism to attract more funding through the creation, through using representativeness bias and through using authority bias or celebrity bias to further buffet their credentials, of creating an exchange where folks could come and trade anything for any amount of money. That was how SBF had pitched it to investors. And it really resonated with folks. And his whole persona of the wild haired genius, I mean, he has kind of a look of a young modern day Einstein. All of it really fit. He didn't sleep much. He would come in disheveled. He would be asked for PowerPoint presentations. He would just put something together. It would look haphazard. It had the whole kind of feel of eccentric genius to it. And he really tapped into that as a way to attract capital to support Alameda further so that Alameda could get out of whatever hole they're in and start to make the kind of money to support the altruistic things they really, really wanted to do.
I'm going to take that even further because I agree with everything you just said, but I think it was even more calculated and directed than that. That whole persona that you just put forward, the whole vision and image of FTX in general, doesn't appeal to the traditional class of investor. A very typical medium to high value investor is value driven. They are calculus driven. They want to see the returns. They want to see what the risk measures are. FTX leveraged this narrative and this image very heavily, which is not of any interest to somebody whose primary consideration is the prospectus and the last 5 years' performance. They also made a very heavy use of celebrity endorsements. If we look over the list, I've got here Kevin O'Leary, Gisele Bündchen, Tom Brady, Steph Curry, Shaquille O'Neal. They had partnerships with Miami Heat, with Major League Baseball, with Mercedes-AMG Petronas F1 team. Quantitative investors don't care about these endorsements. This is a sort of thing that appeals to a less discerning, perhaps less practiced or more naive investor. And this coincided with a very large increase in the retail investor class across the market in general. A lot of people who had not been doing investing, who, in the wake of the pandemic and in the States, pandemic related payments, started getting into managing their own assets. I think it's also not an accident that this is in crypto, that FTX was a crypto exchange, which by virtue of its youth, people still don't have a great deal of familiarity with. And I think it's probably very intentional that they attracted this less experienced class of investor who didn't know to ask, or if they did ask, wouldn't know what to do as effectively with the books or the numbers that FTX might produce. And this would allow them to perform a lot of these, not really off book. We'll get to that because their bookkeeping was curious to say the least, but these poorly regarded lateralizations of capital between Alameda and FTX without too much scrutiny from their own investors. And I think that that is, and again, I emphasize my own speculation here, I think that was intentional. I think that was a source of capital that they could readily tap without the same amount of scrutiny that a traditional investor would subject them to. Now, I know you have some thoughts about the more savvy investors who invested with FTX and with Alameda.
Yes, my research showed that not only was so it's interesting, it was almost like a barbell of investors. You had this appeal to the quote unquote less sophisticated investor or less discerning investor who's really just looking for someone to advise them. And the use of the celebrities was a way of normalizing working with FTX and starting an account with them and dipping your toe in the water. It made crypto, quote unquote, normal, right? Part of the mainstream media, part of mainstream life. One place I want to take this to, one other celebrity I want to mention here, is the use of Larry David. Larry David was prominent, particularly in their Super Bowl ad. Larry David is my contemporary in terms of his age, generation, how long he's been in the media for, and his whole persona lent another level of authenticity to what FTX was doing. It was very, very powerful. Now, going back to the institutional investors, there were some very sophisticated investors, highly respected institutional investors that placed significant sums with FTX. Two of them I'll mention, and they certainly were not the only ones, so I don't want this to sound like I'm picking on them in particular, but I do want to mention a couple of names. One is Sequoia, and the other is Tiger Securities. These are well-known venture capital firms that are highly respected in the elite investor class. And you may say, well, didn't they ask the questions? And the answer from what I could take is they did, but they were essentially told by SBF and team, you can ask the questions, but we're not going to answer them. You're either in or out. And therefore, they played upon those investors' FOMO, the fear of missing out.
And I think even with those institutional investors, those larger value, more educated, more sophisticated investors, that same level of leveraging image and narrative came into play, because one of the things we haven't really talked about a whole lot here is virtually all of the principals at FTX came out of Jane Street. Jane Street, of course, is a very well-respected hedge fund that's been around for decades. Jane Street is known for two things. One, for doing cutting-edge, forward-looking things that nobody else is thinking about. And two, being incredibly secretive and opaque about what they do in-house. And so if you have this consortium of Jane Street alums who are working in the crypto domain, yeah, I can absolutely see how this is representativeness. This is what a maverick, forward-thinking investor or asset manager is supposed to look like. This is what they're supposed to do. And if they say, we're not going to tell you what's going on behind the curtain, that's what Jane Street already does. There's nothing that's really going to raise your eyebrows at that.
And furthermore, by attracting the likes of Sequoia, Tiger, and some other more mainstream venture capital firms with high reputations in the VC industry, that further lent a representativeness to, okay, these guys are okay. They're bringing in some of the biggest investors in the world who are essentially sanctioning what they're doing by making these substantial sums. And the question you may have, and I certainly had, is, well, if they didn't look under the hood, and we know that they probably marked these asset positions down to zero after FTX went bankrupt, what answers did they have for their investors? And it's a simple game of mental accounting that they played. Remember, in the VC space, they're being paid to take risks. And when investors place money with a Sequoia or whoever, they know that there's going to be volatility. They know there are going to be bets that are hit home runs, and there are going to be some that completely strike out. This is one that would strike out. And remember, they're dealing with billions and billions of dollars. So what they invested with FTX is a small amount, relatively small amount with regards to their portfolio. It's something that, in terms of their overall performance, I don't want to say goes out in the rounding. It does hurt in the moment, but it can be explained as part of their investment thesis.
Yeah.
So from a mental accounting standpoint, folks like the two of us would support what Tiger did, even though we would say they should have thought more like a scientist and been more of a skeptic. From an overall mental accounting standpoint, the fact that they were able to rationalize this as one of their many speculative bets that they made that just happened to go wrong is actually a good thing from providing value to investors, particularly if you are limited in time and you see opportunities that may be special and unique. And if they are above board, and if the business model is to what is being presented, could be very, very powerful.
So I want to sort of grab onto a thread there around the Sequoia and the institutional investors and pull it in a little different direction here, because once we start talking about them, once we start talking about these large capital firms and investment houses, now we're into a different space because all of these entities are subject to regulation within their own domains in a way that FTX itself was not, or at least it was the degree of regulation FTX was subject to is ambiguous at present. We know that crypto and digital assets are continuously evolving in terms of how the US government and global financial entities perceive them and choose to regulate them. But I know we've talked extensively about the regulatory aspects of this case, and I want to explore that a bit more. And there are so many different ways or so many different elements of this that, I mean, honestly, we could probably spend an entire episode on this. But I want to just first ask about the audits, because this sort of comes to your larger point early on about due diligence and the lack of due diligence. And there are audits, of course, after the fact, after the collapse occurred, when Sam Bankman-Fried was forced out and a new CEO was put in. But there were also a pair of audits that took place much earlier on in FTX's lifespan, and those were curious, to say the least. Walk me through those.
So yes, it's not as if, even though FTX was a private company, that they weren't being audited. Because remember, they were attracting a lot of investor dollars. And even though investors were not pushing for as much diligence as they probably should have in hindsight, nevertheless, they were looking for some sort of authority sanction. And FTX received that from two particular auditors, Prager Metis, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, or Prager Metis.
We'll just call it Prager.
We'll call him Prager, and Amarino. Those were the two that had audited them. Both are not Big Four firms. I think that's fairly obvious. But Amarino in particular is a top 20 audit firm. And Amarino was primarily responsible for the audits of the FTX exchange itself, whereas as Prager provided the overarching audit on FTX globally, which is really where the problems were in terms of some of the irregularities and malfeasance that eventually came up. both Prager and Armarino stated that FTX were conducting their operations in accordance with generally accepted accounting standards. And when an audit firm that has been licensed and sanctioned puts out statements like that, that lends further credence to what they're doing, and in some sense is complicit with what FTX was able to get away with, even if they weren't the ones actually moving the money around, moving customer funds and all that sort of thing.
I want to just jump in real quick because you used a word there that I think is very important, which is complicit, because I want to start by saying, again, we are once again very heavily within a speculative space. We have no firsthand knowledge, and we cannot state with any certainty that this is what happened. Nevertheless, I find that word to be quite correct in this case because I'm not an auditor. I've never done auditing. I have no licensure or certification to do so. But in looking at some of the things that have come out in congressional testimony since, like, for example, there was apparently no record keeping of any sort in terms of transactions between Alameda and FTX. Apparently, all of the accounting for an 11-figure crypto exchange was done on QuickBooks. Now, I use QuickBooks for my business, but I'm not an 11-figure company. I'm sending invoices a few times a month. Me, as somebody who's not an auditor, would look at this and say, there is no conceivable way that this is in agreement with generally accepted accounting practices. So how could they possibly have said that FTX was on the up and up?
That's a great question, John. I don't think they could. That's my conclusion from auditors and accountants that I know, that there had to be some type of either naivete or willful disbelief in terms of the information that was being presented to them. Because it's hard to fathom that they could not have foreseen some of the things going on given the massive sums of money that were being moved between these entities.
Yeah, it strains credulity that with any sort of marginal competence, one could look at what we now know was happening in FTX, even the stuff that was on book, and conclude that this is the way that a crypto exchange should operate. This is everything here looks good.
And John, I think you have to look again at what has happened since to those firms in the aftermath of the FTX bankruptcy and everything that's come out, which includes the sanctions of Prager, including a $1.2 million fine and several remediation requirements from the SEC. They are essentially right now on probation, and they are limited of taking on new clients, particularly in the crypto space. And then if we look at Armarino, they have quietly exited the audit space for crypto. The group that was doing crypto audits has now started their own firm, which I forgot the name of it, but they have their own firm which now operates out of Miami.
And this is, again, not making any specific accusations, but saying just observation that this particular separation and then refounding is something that we see very commonly with any sort of institution that's been accused of malfeasance or inappropriate or unjustified actions. So yeah, it's really difficult to look at this, I think, and conclude anything other than this was completely unjustified, and they probably knew. They almost certainly knew as it was going on that the FTX does not deserve to pass this audit.
They either knew or they had such junior people, such naive people working on this that didn't know to ask the right questions. And I'm not going to say that that's not possible, but that in and of itself is its own level of negligence And we can get into legal debates about what type of negligence is involved here, but it's certainly negligent at the very, very least.
It's the old accusation. You're either incompetent or a liar. Which is it?
I think that's perfectly stated.
What about the other regulatory domains? Crypto historically has not been subject to a whole lot of regulatory effort by the SEC, or I shouldn't say effort. There's a lot of effort, but there's not a lot of actual on-book regulation by the SEC, by FDIC, by any of the US-based financial entities. Did that play into this in any capacity?
That's a great question, John. And there's a number of angles I'd like to go with this from, but I'm also mindful of our audience's time. So I'll try to keep it to a couple of significant points that I want to touch on here in the regulatory space.
Well, and I think there's also a broader question of what is the appropriate shape of regulation for crypto, but that's probably a three-part conversation.
That in and of itself is, yeah, at least a three-part. I personally would have to do a lot more digging and having conversations with folks much closer to this space than either of us are.
Sure.
So one of the things that I want to just point to, this goes in general for many of the crypto meltdowns, is the lack of regulation. And how is that contributing in some way, shape, or form? So one of the things we have to keep in mind with regards to the banking system is that our banking system, at least here in the United States, has not always had a strong central bank. The creation of strong central banks was in part done in order to instill confidence in the currency being utilized. And I'm not going to go into the whole history of US currency or currency around the world in general. That's probably like a 5-part topic. But the main thing to keep in mind here is that what helped SVB in their time of crisis is that they were provided liquidity by the Fed. And that helped calm things, to instill a sense of confidence and to slow some of the panic and buy time for an ultimate resolution, buy time for the white knight. Another aspect to having regulation is the requirements around accounting and around risk management that need to be in place. And as flawed as those regulations are, and there's never going to be perfect regulation, let's be very clear, but the existence of such regulation, the existence of having to show sufficient capital, of having to show controls in how things are being accounted for and being managed in terms of transfers and so forth, those things all lent an air of confidence once the Fed and others stepped in, that things were eventually going to resolve themselves, and kept things at a manageable level, actually managed the overall level of contagion that folks were initially worried about, if we recall. These crypto exchanges and these stable coins, such as FTT, do not have that, or did not have that. There was nobody to come in and pump liquidity in. That was why the late hour negotiations with Binance, that was largely to get some more money, to buy more time for FTX to continue to work through their problems. But again, Binance was a competitor, not someone looking to prop up a system. So the fact that FTT's value had plummeted like a stone, yeah, is of some concern to overall financial markets, but that's not something that is in either the SEC or the Feds or any other sanctioned regulatory body to navigate and to try to prop up in some way to maintain financial stability. So that lack of regulation hurt in the case of when FTX started to go sideways. And I would say it also applies to Terra Luna and some of the other systems that have experienced difficulties in the last couple of years. One other angle I would like to present here, in addition to the liquidity support and the risk management requirements, is that SBF was actually working with both the SEC and the CFTC for regulations. And he wasn't far from getting the CFTC to bring crypto exchanges under their wing. And you may be surprised to hear that, given everything that's occurred and given all of the malfeasance that was going on. But taking a step back and pointing back to earlier parts of our podcast today around finding normality, finding sanctioning, giving validity to what SBF was doing by inviting regulation in, and particularly he was shaping the regulation by inviting that in. What I believe he was doing, and I'll never know for sure, but I believe he was bringing in even another level of sanctioning, which would have provided additional cover for all of the good they were doing that they were trying to finance by expropriating customer funds, or misappropriating, I should say.
And I think that there's a really interesting wrinkle on that, because in courtroom testimony, it's come to light that there are some private messages on Twitter via text where Bankman-Fried has, it's a stretch to say it's on record, but there's documentation of him saying to people that he doesn't believe in regulation in any capacity. He doesn't think regulation does any good. It doesn't protect consumers. It accomplishes nothing positive for the market. Regulation is trash. He's also on record as saying that a lot of the things that they do are purely window dressing. It's optics. It's to make things look good and palatable to governing bodies and to potential consumers and investors. So I think that actually connects very well with this assertion that this will give them a level of cover. This would further facilitate their ability to do what they know best. They know best what to do, and they just need to get everything else out of their way so that they can go ahead and go about the business of making as much money as they can so that they can do all the good they can for the world. So it's an interesting sort of, again, connecting all the dots together. They all connect in a really interesting way and paint a very curious picture.
John, those are all great points. And I just want to add one other little behavioral wrinkle from what we teach in our class,
Hmm.
which is that SBF, by driving potential regulation, was leveraging his own, what we call IKEA bias. We tend to, or endowment effect, there's an endowment aspect to this as well, that when something is created that we have significantly contributed to, we are more likely to be much more supportive and will go to lengths to defend it and protect it. It's part of our territorial nature as animals. And I believe, even though SBF, and I agree with you, he has all those quotes about being anti-regulation, I think his anti-regulation is because he didn't write it. And therefore, it must be stupid. I didn't create it. Why would I trust somebody else, what somebody else is telling me to do?
Yeah, arrogance seems to be I would say recurring, but really universal theme among all of the principles here. And if he wasn't responsible for its creation, or didn't at least have a hand in it, of what value could it be? So all of this together, how do we take lessons away from this? This is such a different shape of violations, of breaches, of a financial collapse compared to things like SVB. When we look back at SVB, we can put our 2020 hindsight glasses on and say, okay, look, if they had had a better model, if they had commitment to paying attention to their model, if they had stricter capital requirements, all of this could have been avoided. Like, here, we could build them an ERM program right here, right now, and say, if you implement steps A, B, and C, and then follow up with items 1, 2, and 3, SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, would still be an independent entity and fully solvent today. This is a much thornier sort of risk management question, because You had all of the major principals coming in, all of the stakeholders of FTX coming in with a uniform purpose from the start. This, again, if our speculation is correct, all of them came in with this commitment to what most people would consider to be malfeasant behavior. How do you mitigate against that? This is, I would argue, this is a really pernicious form of groupthink. The entire management team, the entire executive body of FTX and Alameda Research came in already in agreement. There was never any intent to find alternative paths. There was never any intent to see why they might be wrong. They came in with the assumption that we're correct. We know we're correct. We are going to implement our correctness upon the world. I don't know that you really can mitigate against this. I don't know that there's any good way to mitigate against philosophy or to screen for it. I think really the best we can do for these sorts of things is identify what red flag should you as an investor and as a regulator or oversight body be paying attention for. And I think that this sort of very quirky, very characteristic groupthink is much more common in organizations that are smaller, that are younger, and where all of the original stakeholders are active in upper management. I think these sorts of entities are much more prone to this. I don't think we could get this in Vanguard today. I don't think we could get this in Morgan Stanley because there are too many people coming from too many different directions with too many different philosophical backgrounds that you could never get this unanimity of purpose and direction. Do you agree, disagree?
I largely agree with what you're saying, having worked both within and with large financial organizations. It is much more difficult. I don't want to go out and say it's not possible because people are capable of unbelievable atrocities.
Sure.
And even within groups, if a culture is created that empowers just a small handful of people and no one questions them, then yes, this could happen at some of the larger financial institutions. I'm not going to tell you it can't. It is less likely, however. So I do agree with your premise that when dealing with more of these startup, smaller group, private companies where there's limited history and information and the business model has not been tested, that this is more likely to occur. So this all goes back to the odds of something occurring versus whether they could or not. I never questioned the ability of human beings to do some pretty terrible things.
But then, okay, that's an interesting point. Extrapolating from that, then maybe we can make a more general recommendation, more general sense of red flag that compartmentalization and autonomy make this sort of unanimity of purpose, this conviction that leads to a disregard for any sort of regulatory or operational standard much more able to occur.
I would say that's more accurate. And in fact, what I've seen in the history of financial problems and collapses and disasters is that those things are often the contributors, even within some of the largest firms, such as I'll just bring up tangentially a little bit, AIG.
Mm.
So going back to the financial crisis and what occurred with AIG, it all came from a relatively small group within one business unit that was essentially a startup business unit within the firm called AIG's Financial Products Group or something to that effect. And that group was allowed to operate outside of the norms of AIG proper, and they were given tremendous autonomy in part because they were a new source of growth and revenue, and no one was going to question what they were doing.
So then basically the takeaway here is when you see groups that are highly compartmentalized away from the rest of an organization, or that they themselves are just an independent entity that doesn't have firm connections to other businesses or public entities, and they have a great deal of autonomy to execute business as they see fit, your hackles should be up. You should be giving this particular group a bit more attention than you might otherwise. I think this also ties back to something in the book, that chapter title that never ceases to be relevant, which is beware smart people in large groups. When you have a whole bunch of people who are all accustomed to being the smartest people in the room, who all have the same purpose in mind, it's really difficult to dissuade them or convince them that another way might be more appropriate.
That's all true. And I would add a couple of other potential yellow flags, red flags for folks to consider when they're making investment decisions. And I really think this does come to your earlier point, John. The discipline with a firm like FTX is not going to come from within management. That's going to be very, very hard to change or persuade. I'm not convinced either one of us could persuade someone like SBF or even anybody within his inner circle to change what they did. And certainly I don't see myself talking them out of their effective altruism philosophy.
Right.
It has to come from accountability driven by the stakeholders. And in particular, I would start with the investor class because they're the ones that are making the decisions with their next dollar.
Sure.
It's a capital allocation decision. And it goes back to things that you and I have talked about in the book, particularly think like a scientist and be willing to walk away and don't allow yourself to get caught up in the fear of missing out. And if you are going to get swept up into those things, such as some very prominent investors did with FTX, you want to make sure that you're not putting a large percentage of assets into it. So if you don't get all the information you want, if you don't get all the answers you want, but you still feel there's a viable business model, all I'm going to say is buyer beware.
Sure.
I personally would, I mean, this is just my own investing philosophy. I would not invest in something that I haven't done the due diligence on and haven't or had someone in appropriate credentials diligence for me. But I understand that in a fast-paced world where there are all of these emerging technologies and emerging opportunities, that there isn't always the information or even the time to do this work. Just be careful with that and practice good mental accounting and only allocate a certain piece that you can afford to lose within the overall structure of what you're doing.
Continuing on that theme of what sort of mitigations can investors themselves take to protect them from collapses and malicious or malfeasant entities like this, something this just occurred to me as we were talking here today, which is beware organizations that have belligerent principles. I'm thinking of that public and ongoing conflict between Zhao and Bankman-Fried, and this served neither company's interests. This was not something that was positive for really either one. And as we were talking about, it got me thinking of Elon Musk and many of the stances that he's taken of late in the last couple of years, very public stances that have nothing to do with Tesla, and in many cases have everything to do with poking at and ruffling the feathers of people in government offices or unrelated businesses. And what we see in every one of these cases is that belligerent principles create volatility. They, in the case of FTX, it may have kindled a kind of hit against them by somebody else, but regardless, it creates volatility. It makes for a great deal of uncertainty in whatever your position is if you're an investor in them. And I'm betraying my own biases here in terms of how I like to look at investing and making money. I want to see a CEO who doesn't have a Twitter account. I want to see a CEO who has no idea what social media is. And even if they hate their competitor with a violent passion, will smile and shake hands with them when they're in the same room together. Belligerent principles never are a good sign for the long-term health of an organization.
I agree with that philosophy, John. In my experience, you certainly want to compete and you want to compete hard, but you want to compete fairly and you want to play within the rules. And if the rules in some way are genuinely shackling economic activity, that's where the efforts should be made to work within the system, to work within the entire structure to create meaningful change. What I see with some of these entrepreneurs, such as Elon Musk, and certainly some of the statements from SPF, are folks that just want less regulation, or where they want regulation, it's solely to serve their own means. And that sort of excessive self-interest type of activity is something that is always going to be a red flag for me.
Yeah.
One last point regarding red flags. One of the things that I questioned in terms of why investors didn't see the amount of leverage being taken. And what I was reminded of in terms of my research, and I know this even from my own due diligence and in my career, is that companies, especially companies that are not publicly traded, can be pretty adept at doing things at quarter end, making certain transactions to temporarily make themselves look better. It's like putting lipstick on a pig for a day and then taking it off again the following day. So sometimes you could be looking at just a snapshot of a company, particularly on the balance sheet side, which by definition is a snapshot. And it may not portray what's really going on. So you do need to be a little bit careful, even when looking diligently at balance sheets. There are some things that can be hidden, and that's just a reality. And that's why I believe asking some of these harder questions that you've stated, John, with regards to the behaviors, the beliefs, how things are managed, the processes in place, those can be better indicators of what's really going on behind the curtain.
Yeah. And I think that as an investor, one of the most important pieces of due diligence you can do is what is the foundational framework, the philosophical, the calculational, the rational framework of the leadership of whatever organization you're evaluating. This can be really hard to get at because you're basically, unless you have an opportunity to sit down with them on multiple occasions, you're reliant on whatever's public facing. But it's one of the most important questions to ask.
Agreed.
The FTX collapse was definitely a quirky and perhaps unique event. And yeah, it's probably something that traditional mitigation approaches would not have done a whole lot to help with. Nevertheless, there are a lot of lessons to pull from this, and I think that these more extreme examples help us figure out what we ourselves should do to position ourselves better, to insulate and de-risk ourselves, more so than what could we do to potentially have remediated the institution itself. Both important questions to ask, but in this case, I don't really know that there are a whole lot of lessons about what shape of ERM program or what shape of due diligence internally at FTX could have made anything better. If management is not committed, or at least has some level of observation of solid, robust practice, there's really nothing that can be done. Any sort of de-risking and risk management assumes at least a willingness by leadership to try to implement the program appropriately. So I suppose the broader take home here is the best shape of risk mitigation you can do is on yourself, making sure that whatever choices you make are the most considered and take into account all of the available information in the best way possible, and that you catch whatever red flags may be out there. Thank you for joining us this episode. We look forward to talking with you again later.
Thank you.
Behavior and Risk is brought to you by Capita Solutions. Behavior and Risk staff includes our research team, Sherry Xu and Jin Zhang, and our editing team, Qingying Gao and Athena Liu. Theme music by Crypt of Insomnia. The opinions presented here are solely those of John Burkhart and Rich Loria and do not represent those of Columbia University, Capita Solutions, or any other organization. We thank you for taking a chance on us today.